Morning, Liz. I'm joined today by Liz Weaver, co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and Liz is in Hamilton in Canada. But I'll hand over to you, Liz. Can you just say a wee bit about what Tamarack does, who you are?
Sure, yeah. So Tamarack is very much a colleague organization of Collaborating for Impact. We work predominantly pan-Canadian, and we have two parts to our work. So one part is helping change makers do their jobs more effectively and more efficiently through our learning center. And we have a ton of online tools and resources that we've developed and deliver. And then the other part is working in place with community. And so we have a cross-Canadian network that is focused on cities reducing poverty. We have another part of our network that is looking at neighbors and emergency response, and that's called Deepening Community, Cities Deepening Community. And then the final and brand new initiative that we've launched is working with communities across Canada around building better youth futures. And so it's really helping youth transition through high school graduation into either post-secondary education or employment or training. And so I think totally we work with about 400 different communities across Canada, the US, and in other places.
Great. And just to say, Tamarack's been a great partner with CFI over the years. As we've grown, we've been learning from what you've been doing in Canada as we started off. And anyway, it's great you're going to share your thoughts as well. You're incredibly generous partners with us. So what we've been exploring, Liz, is what are we seeing through COVID? What are you seeing in terms of where conditions have ripened to enable collaboration?
It's interesting, there have been a number of patterns that have happened I think in Canada and the US is the context that I've been watching. And so in Canada, what we've seen are two really interesting patterns. There's a pattern around emergency response or quick response. And so there are either pre-existing groups that have just jumped right in and are supporting their communities in a whole variety of ways, or there are new leaders who have used virtual platforms to really respond quite quickly. And in my community, for example, Hamilton, there is a Caremongering Hamilton post on Facebook, and every day someone's putting up either something that they need or something that they can give away. And there's this kind of exchange that happens almost on a daily basis. So we've seen that trend of quick response. The second trend that I think is really interesting is a trend around those communities that had pre-existing networks have been deepened or enriched, right? So there have been people, government folks, business leaders that are looking to the community to, get something out or to tap into a network that exists already. And so we've seen that kind of happen where there are those pre-existing networks. They have actually grown and have thrived through this time and have actually deepened. And sometimes it's even people in the community looking to that network as a place to at least exchange ideas or participate. I was talking to a group in Leeds Grenville, which is in Ontario, and they were saying, they used to have trouble getting people to their meetings, and they had a network of about 30, and that network has grown to 60 in this time, and everybody shows up for each one of those calls, and they do it all virtually. So it's interesting, that that pattern we're seeing over and over again with the communities. And so those are two things that we've seen. And then I think maybe I'll add in one more thing that I've seen at a systems level is that there's much more conversation about, how do we build back better, or how do we invest in people as we're building back, or what has this pandemic and other things, what has it uncovered as flaws in systems, right? Mm-hmm. And so there is a conversation that's happening in many different spheres across Canada and the US around that as well. So really quick responses, deepening of networks, starting to have the systems conversation.
It's interesting. I know over the years we've talked about the similarities between Canada and Australia, and actually a lot of what you've said has been mirrored here around where there is infrastructure and pre-existing collaborations. They fared much better through COVID, and equally have been in a far better position to respond. And we're now moving to, we're looking at, hopefully not, but a second wave happening here after there's been a relaxation of it. And I think what we're seeing is people are trying to keep the heat around those, around what's been uncovered through COVID, to try and keep the heat on those issues, so that they don't slide off as we kind of get used to this. So I'm interested in what you're seeing there about what are some of the challenges as we now have to adjust to an ongoing reality of the pandemic. What are you seeing as some of the continual barriers or the challenges people are facing in collaborating? What's the kind of shadow side of it?
Yeah, at the very beginning, we saw people reacting from a fight, flight, or freeze perspective, right? And often freezing because there was so much unknown. And I think now we're going into, well, we know a little bit more, we don't know a lot more, but we know a little bit more. But we're almost coming to another freeze point, right? Where people are saying, not sure if I have to go back to work, not sure what's going to happen with when kids go back to school in September, not sure what the economic impact of all of this is going to be on my family as we're trying to navigate this through. And so I think, what's really important in this time is to really help people kind of reflect on, and this is, I'm doing a series of workshops with a group in Ontario in a month or so. And the first part of that workshop is really to reflect on what just happened, right? So I asking the question, what? So what happened? How did you respond? What worked well? What didn't work well? What does this mean for you? And spending some intentional time in reflection before you go into the so what. So what do we expect will happen next? So what, can we bring forward from our reflection and then into the now what, right? And I think we just keep moving from day to day in this process. And we really need to think about, okay, so how are we reflective? How are we looking at, what just happened, how we responded, and then what capacity did we build in this time to really be able to leverage that capacity moving forward? And I think, it's a really good opportunity to help communities in those conversations, particularly communities where networks have been probably leaned upon without the requisite resources, right? So they probably responded right away. And if you do get a second wave, they'll probably be leaned upon again. But what kind of resources does it really take? What did they do? What are the resources they had in place? And if we were to have another wave or another kind of critical event happening, how do you leverage that? And what kind of resources does it really require?
Yeah, no, that's a great observation, Liz. And I'm thinking, Tamarack takes up this role as an intermediary, a bit like Collaboration for Impact. And often, and in these conditions, we're called upon really to be that container or to hold people through that. I'm interested in, we've been doing a lot of soul searching through this around how do we respond and what do we need to change. And I'm curious about what's happened for Tamarack and for you in this, in the role of, an intermediary trying to create change and change conditions. What have you had to shift or do differently in your thinking or how you work?
Yeah, it was really interesting, at the very beginning, because part of our revenue stream is self-generated. But at the very beginning of COVID, in the end of March, early April period, we really said to ourselves as an organization, that's not where people are at. What people need is quick information and an opportunity to learn for free. And so we ramped up our webinars. So we used to do webinars kind of a couple times a month, and we went to weekly webinars, and sometimes we did 2 webinars in a week, and we really tried to get people to think a little bit differently, to talk to people that might be raising issues around navigating change or navigating into the virtual environment. So we did that. We also started to reflect in a weekly newsletter some things that communities were doing to respond. And so we did a couple of issues of COVID and community building. And then as we were doing those issues, and we would put them out on a weekly basis, and we were tracking, who was reading what. Once people settled in about a month into the pandemic, we kind of pivoted, and we started to see that people were really interested in, they've kind of relaxed, and now what can I learn, right? And so we started to put tools and resources and links to tools and resources. 3 months in, we kind of ended our COVID and community building focus, but we decided to keep the free webinars going because they were so popular and people really looked to them. And we also really started to reflect how to promote tools, resources, but things that people could use, right? So if they moved to a virtual workplace, which happened, kind of instantaneously in Canada, we had at Tamarack, we're a virtual organization anyways, and we had an internal document that we just open sourced, right? So it was something that we developed for our own team to talk about navigating virtual environments. We just put it out there on our website and said, hey, here's how you navigate virtual environments. And we hosted a webinar about it and just made it available to everybody. And that was very kind of cool. And people came back to us and said, okay, what have you learned? Or they gave us feedback that was really helpful. And we reached out, one of our partners came to us and said, this is a really good document. Have you ever thought about creating a similar document for youth that are entering employment but have to work in a virtual environment? And we said, oh, that's kind of a cool idea. They said, would you want to partner with us around it? And within a month, they turned around a youth virtual work guide. And a web space for it. And it's actually much better than our guide. But it's kind of like being able to look at where opportunities are presenting themselves and then continually watching when you have to pivot, right? So not getting so caught in the mire, but just saying, okay, so what is, especially with a thing like COVID, and I think, in Australia, you've had 2 crises back to back, right? You've had the bushfires, and now you have COVID, and now you might have another wave of COVID. So you're kind of in these continual waves. And so, it's really thinking about, okay, so what are we seeing and experiencing that we might be able to add value to, our network of learners and members, and how do we also capture in a way that honors what their responses have been and reflect that back to them. And so our Vibrant community partners have produced a guide which looks at how their communities have responded to the pandemic, which is very interesting as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just for anybody as well watching, really check out Tamarack's vast resources that they've got on their website. There's some really useful work there. Just finally, Liz, ending on, what's giving you hope through all this? We're on this roller coaster trying to make sense of it. What gives you hope?
Oh my goodness. It depends on the day that sometimes I'm hopeful and sometimes I'm fearful. But I do think the hope that I see is the fact that people have really responded. They have rolled up their sleeves. They have responded in different kinds of ways. And I think that there is much more of a conversation happening about how to build back better, or however we frame that, right? We've seen the real flaws being exposed in the systems that we're working in. And I think that provides us with an opportunity. And I think there's lots of people that are in that conversation. Some might say there are too many people, but, I think you get to a spot by having lots of those kinds of conversations. And so hopefully we'll be able to maintain the momentum.
Mm. Lovely, lovely note to end on. Thanks, Liz. And all the best to you all over there in Canada. And thanks very much for joining us today. All the best with it.
You're very welcome.